Once, there was a beautiful kingdom known as Middlewood. It was a land of bountiful fields, deep forests, and sparkling lakes, surrounded by jagged hills that pierced the very clouds. The people were happy and lacked nothing. It was a time of peace. However, in the high courts and councils of the capital city of Rootnot, a sickness was festering, the deadly disease known as sin. In their hubris, the leaders of the nation had grown lax, and without their guidance, the people turned to hedonism, black magic, and other depraved acts. Some began worshipping false gods, or even none at all. The once pristine kingdom had become a cesspool of immorality. Soon, the wrath of Alros fell upon Middlewood. For disobeying his words, he punished the sinners swiftly and justly. He rained fire down upon the tall towers and domes of Rootnot, in order to burn down the heart of the corruption. Those who renounced their evil ways and turned to Alros were spared, while those who refused his wisdom were either put on trial or banished. And so it was that the weak men who had succumbed to their carnal desires and dragged the kingdom into filth were swept away in a flood of fire. The people who embraced the words of Alros did away with their foolish old masters, and only the smoldering ashes of the once thriving city remained, serving as a warning to anyone who would dare oppose his will again. What more could a young man wish for than to own a sap refinery in the Cloud Hills? Moylin's father asked as the stagecoach crested another ridge. A million things, Moylin answered in his mind. But his father wasn't actually waiting for his reply. And not just for the money, he continued, but for the location. Mogran Moylanad gestured out the window. Sure, the sap itself is worth its weight in gold, but when it comes to the view, even the highest nobles of Kistral are envious. And certainly the ladies, too, his father added with a wink. Actually, he continued, glancing outside, suddenly he barked at the coachman to stop the carriage. Then he turned back to his son. I think we're coming up on the peak right now. Let's take a break and have a look. Stepping out of the coach, Moylin immediately felt the tug of the harsh mountain wind trying to rip his carefully curled and plaited hair out of its arrangement. The small fairy pulled his robes tighter and blinked fiercely to keep his eyes from tearing up and smudging his makeup. His father didn't wait. In his ill-fitting pantaloons and his old-fashioned blue coat, he raced up the short incline. Amazingly, even though Mogran was both much older and wider than the last time they had visited, he bounced up the hillside with surprising speed. Look, Moylin, there it is, the old fairy exclaimed. Standing against the wide-open sky, Moylin noted, his father looked noticeably smaller than he did back home in his office, but also much more alive, while the strong wind and the crisp spring air made Moylin shudder and shrink into himself. It seemed to have the opposite effect on Mogran. Isn't it wonderful? He asked his son, without turning his head. It's so free, so full of promises. The patriarch of the Moylanad family flung his arms out to the side and grinned. This is nothing like court life, son. All that your mother has taught you about holding teacups properly or penning dinner invitations is all well and good in the city. But out here you can forget all of that. As long as you bring in the sap, even a baron can wipe his hands on his pants out here without being labeled a slob. Demonstratively, his father spat on the ground. Moylin couldn't help but notice that the spit was a dull greenish brown, indicative of chewing leaves. He had told his mother he had quit years ago, but that was another benefit of the frontier life to him, Moylin supposed. What the wife back home wouldn't find out wouldn't hurt her. He had tried to tell his father that he didn't want to wipe his hands on his pants and spit on the ground. Moylin actually enjoyed dinner parties and holding teacups the correct way, but Mogran didn't understand. To him, manners and etiquette were just a formality, a ritual that socialites and aristocrats in the city performed to differentiate themselves from the commoners. It was a way to show that you were raised right, that you knew the right people and had the means to become an important figure in society. The real price of owning property, his father had once told him, is that you have to dress uncomfortably and speak like a pansy. Moylin couldn't entirely disagree either. There had definitely been times in his youth when the ceremonial small talk had seemed like a maddening waste of time to him. and sometimes it still did. But unlike his father, he didn't find the alternative any more pleasant. If the choice was between having to refold his napkin every time he wiped his mouth, or having to spend weeks on end rattling around on backcountry roads in a shaky carriage while spitting on things, Moylan would much rather fold napkins. Having to put up with formalities was a small price to pay for luxuries like being able to take a bath every day. By Alros, he wanted a bath. His father was right about one thing, though. It was definitely refreshing to be out in the open, far from the smoke and noise and filth of the city. Lately, it had seemed a more and more miserable place. Every day there were more stories about terrible crimes coming from the seedier districts of Kistrala. No matter how many guards patrolled the streets, vandalism, thievery, and violence seemed to fester in the slums. It had gotten to the point where Moylan rarely ever travelled on foot through the city anymore. Not that he had ever been accosted personally, but he didn't want to risk it. Since he was usually travelling in one of his father's carriages with his personal guards, it would be an embarrassment to the whole family if Moylan ended up in trouble. House Moylanad would look very weak if they weren't even able to protect their only heir from bandits and other ruffians. There! Do you see it? Mogran was pointing off into the distance, but Moylan wasn't looking. He had just reached the top, stooped to catch his breath, and when he looked back up, he became overwhelmed by the sight. Before him, the cloud hills lay spread across the horizon in all their glory. Again, his father had been right. They had definitely not left Kistrala too early. All throughout the valley, the massive treetops stood in full bloom. The dense canopies danced like waves on a sea of red, gold, and green. Had they set off a week later, they might have missed it. Here up on the cliffs, the trees weren't much larger than they were back in Sylmania, but below them was the Deepwood, where the great blood birches grew. It was said that the oldest ones, on the banks of the Dream River, were as wide as the Crystal Palace in Kistrala, and taller than the Great Sluice. Along their trunks grew countless vines and other climbing plants, reaching their brightly colored tendrils up towards the sun above. Buzzing around them was an unending choir of pollinators and other insects, preyed upon by exotic birds that were in turn hunted by wild fairies, woodlings, and other forest creatures. Moylan simply stood there for a short while, taking in the scene with all his senses. The sharp sunlight created a dazzling display out of all the flowers, and the birdsong and the rustling of millions of leaves in the wind added to the cacophony of impressions. A deep breath brought him the smells of earth, moss, and mulch that was so different from the air back home. As his gaze finally landed on the point beyond his father's outstretched finger, all the memories came back at once. There, above the leaves beyond the next ridge, he could spot the rooftops and towers of the manor. The polished clay shingles gleamed in the sun, and the white, blue, and purple flags of Sylmania and House Moylanad fluttered in the breeze. Good to be back, isn't it? The old fairy placed a firm hand on his son's shoulder. Looking up at him, Moylan briefly saw the spry young man Mogran had been, the first time he and his mother had brought him here as a child. The new father who still took part in games and hunts with the other young men, while most of Moylan's aunts and uncles had already retreated to the parlour, or fallen asleep in the summer sun with more than a few drinks under their belt. Back then, Moylan's mother had taken him for walks in the nearby woods and fields. She had told him stories, and taught him about all the trees and plants as they waited for Mogran to return from the refinery. Back when he had a full head of hair, and hers wasn't white. When neither of them had deep-set lines of worry across their foreheads, and in the corners of their mouths. Before the war. When he thought about it, Moylan had hardly seen any evidence of the war at all. Aside from the occasional scouts, messengers, and bands of returning soldiers they had met on the road, the forest seemed as quiet and peaceful as ever. At least until now. Before he could answer his father, he became aware of a creaking sound among the rocks and trees. Something large was approaching from down the road. His father seemed unaware, until he saw Moylan whip his head around and confusedly turned to look in the same direction. For a few short moments, they both stood still, watching intently. Moylan glanced behind them at the carriage, where the guards and coachman waited obediently. They had been so quiet that he had forgotten about their presence. Clearly, though, they had not forgotten about his, as they were all staring at him questioningly, with their hands on their sword hilts. Once they also became aware of the sound, they started squinting and craning their necks to spot its source among the trees. Then, a heavy wooden wagon came rolling precariously along the narrow path, pulled by two enormous muskmurs. The beasts were tied on a line as they were too large to walk next to each other. When someone spotted and called attention to the blue and lavender pennants on their harnesses that indicated Sylmanian ownership, everyone exhaled in relief. Moylan could never get used to seeing their unnerving gait as the huge beasts made their way up the road. Miskmers were native to the Deepwood, and seldom seen outside the region. The strange creatures appeared entirely bovine from their massive snouts to their legs, with massive curved horns, and a thick mane of curly fur that nearly reached down to the ground. However, instead of hooves, they had arms and legs, like those of a man. Sometimes they would walk on their knuckles, and other times they gripped onto roots and rocks with their long fingers, when the path became too steep or bumpy. This made them excellent for transporting goods along the narrow roads that snaked along the Cloud Hills down to Sylmenia proper. Cargo such as lumber, bark spice, and of course, massive quantities of the finest Elmarain sap, as the local variety was called. Mogran had named it after his wife and Moylan's mother, Elmarain Moylanad. She was still back home in Kistrala, managing the family's business, and right now, Moylan thought, that was probably for the best. His mother had never seemed comfortable around woodlings. Of course, she spoke to them politely, and had even invited some of them over for tea and pastries in Moylan's youth, when things had been more peaceful. However, he had noticed how she always flinched slightly, and kept her distance when they crossed paths with one. The last time they were here, she had walked around with a guard whenever they ventured away from the property. Moylan didn't know if that had been her decision or his father's. She never mentioned it, and never even acknowledged the armored man behind them at all, that last tense summer. Nor did any of the woodlings they had met dare object to his silent presence. Now though, Moylan suddenly stood face to face with at least 20 of them, staring at him with hollow eyes. The road was so narrow that Moylan and his father had to step off into the moss when the carriage came rolling by. As the barred windows passed by right in front of his face, he realized that it was a huge prison wagon. In fact, the carriage was so wide and so crowded that he could barely even see the windows on the other side. From inside, several woodling children peered out at him. Their smooth skin had yet to develop the distinct bark-like texture that the adults had, and was instead pale and green, almost like that of a fairy. Their eyes, however, had yet to bloom. Woodlings were born with regular eyes, except their pupils were entirely circular, lacking the intricate patterns found in a fairy's eye. As they matured, the younglings' eyes would slowly grow layer upon layer of a greenish film, which covered their pupils and eyes until they were completely blind. At that point, they had to rely entirely on their tribe to guide them, until their eyes finally bloomed, which was seen as a major rite of passage. During that intermedial phase, the growths on their eyes resembled large dangling buds, and that's what made Moylan instinctively look away. Instead, he accidentally locked eyes with the child's mother, who was sitting behind her son on the thin layer of straw on the floor. She was holding him anxiously, shielding him from anyone who might bump into him if the carriage rocked. Her eyes, like on all woodlings in their prime, were in full bloom. Long, slender petals with a velvety carmine surface lined the edges of her eyelids, where the eyelashes would be on a fairy. However, several of them were bent and torn, and a few were missing entirely. Moylan had no idea if a woodling's eye petals ever grew back. Guiltily, he shifted his gaze once again, averting his eyes entirely until the carriage had passed. When he looked back, however, it was still standing there. An exasperated groan from its coachman came in response to his confusion. Looking over, Moylan realized that the roan carriage was blocking the road. The Miskmers stamped impatiently, and the Fagels that pulled Mogran's old-fashioned coach did the same. They were a type of large, flightless bird, commonly found in Sylmenia and the surrounding lands. Their grey coats and thin, pearlescent combs shimmered in the dappled sunlight, and their chirping and cawing added to the tumult as the 2 coachmen and a dozen guards tried to come to an agreement on who would have to move out of the way, and how. Rats! Mogran let out a long, frustrated sigh and slapped his forehead with his palm. That's going to delay us at least half an hour. He frowned and considered the situation for a second. Do you want to just walk there instead? It'll probably be faster. I don't know, Moylan answered truthfully after a moment of hesitation. He really didn't want to walk, but he also didn't want to stand around and wait next to the captured woodlings. None of them said anything. They just stared silently out between the bars or at the floor. It made Moylan very uneasy. Suddenly, the implication of the sight hit him. Those are children, he observed. When squinting to see deeper into the packed carriage, he got a cold sensation in the pit of his stomach. They're all women and children. Moylan quickly turned towards Mogran, looking for any reaction in his face. Yes, it's very sad, he responded. Frustrated, Moylan tried again. What I mean is, why are they imprisoned? I thought they were only going to capture Motstan members, he demanded, referring to the barbaric woodling cult that had been attacking Sylmenians in the area. Supposedly, the army had finally managed to drive out the last of the Mutstan from the Cloud Hills, which was the only reason Moylan and his father were able to return. "Does your boy need a talking to?" came a brusque, tinny voice from behind. Moylan spun around to see one of the soldiers that had accompanied the prison wagon. His visor was designed like a demon's face, and the helmet's unmoving steel gaze made Moylan's blood run cold, which was the intention. In his hands, he held a heavy crossbow. By how casually he handled it, Moylan thought that surely it was unloaded, but when he looked closer, he realized it was cocked. A 3-bladed broadhead was knocked to the string. He recognized it from his archery lessons back home. Not only that, but a small paper package was attached to the back of it. Moylan's eyes widened. "Wait, isn't that—" "That's enough," Mogran interrupted, grabbing him by the shirt collar and pulling him away like a child. Moylan gasped, out of indignation more so than shock. "Forgive him. He's just curious," his father said to the soldier, still holding Moylan by the collar. He turned to his son. "Don't bother the peacekeepers, Moylan. They have a very important job to do." Moylan's eyebrow twitched. "Like locking up women and children?" he exclaimed, his face starting to flush red. "Why, you little brat!" the enraged soldier began. Then a loud clang rang out, and the man suddenly dropped to the ground. "That's Lord Moylanad's boy, you inbred hick!" The other soldier, who had just whacked his subordinate over the head with his sword hilt, spoke with a Kistralan accent. "I apologize, my lord," he continued in a slightly more formal tone. "I apologize, my lord," came a mocking voice from the ground. The first soldier was still lying face down in the dirt. However, as the rest of them looked down at him in confusion, he quickly spun around and swept the other man's leg out. A moment later, they were both tumbling around in the dirt, swearing at each other. "I'll teach you to show some damn respect," roared the Kistralan man, pinning his fellow down and aiming a punch with a gauntleted fist. "Don't tell me what to do." The demon-faced soldier was the younger of the two, but also taller and more broad-shouldered. "I'm sick of this jungle, and I'm sick of taking orders from you," he growled. Before the punch connected, he headbutted his superior and pushed him off. With a loud clattering, the older man rolled down the slope next to the road and crashed into a thick tree. "I just want to get out of this place, get drunk, get laid, and get as far away from you and this damned forest as possible." The insubordinate young man practically spat his words out, but the captain didn't listen. His helmet had come off in the impact, revealing a fairy around Mogran's age, except battle-scarred, rugged, and unshaven. He had a fiery look in his eyes as he stomped up the hillside towards the disrespectful youngster. Moments later, he had pulled the stout soldier down again, and now they were both tumbling through the shrubbery down the slope. Mogran, on the other hand, seemed completely dumbfounded by the situation. His hand was still gripping onto his son's shirt collar, so Moylan tried to nudge his father out of his confused state by jerking his head to the side. Suddenly, Mogran appeared to remember his authority and the fact that he was the owner of this land. "Stop this nonsense," he commanded in a firm voice. "I want the carriage situation sorted out as soon as possible. Deliver our luggage by foot if you have to, or I'll make sure your commander hears about this." Then he turned around hastily, his midnight blue coat fluttering behind him. "Come, Moylan, we're walking," he said without looking back. Moylan hesitated for a second. The two soldiers below were still locked in a grapple, about to attack each other, but both of them had stopped and looked at Mogran when he spoke. It seemed that the interruption had cleared most of the tension, so instead they awkwardly let go of each other. When they realized Moylan was still watching them, they quickly got up and began readjusting and dusting off their armor. As the captain was putting his helmet back on, the heavyset soldier suddenly leaned over and mumbled something to him, and then nodded towards Moylan. The older man grinned. "Wouldn't be the first," he replied, without looking away. Moylan tensed up. He'd rather not find out what that meant, and so he quickly turned around and ran off to catch up with his father. The manor disappeared behind the trees again, as the road dipped and curved into a shallow ravine. Here, the air was significantly cooler. As the susurration of the canopies faded, it was replaced by the sounds from within the forest. There was the creaking of giant tree trunks shifting, the buzzing of insects, and the occasional bleating from some distant critter. In the background was a constant symphony of birdsong that emanated from everywhere all at once. Moylan peered down over the side of the cliff, down into the Deepwood. The unending mossy branchwork created a myriad of shifting shadows from the patches of sunlight filtering down from above. Here and there, vines and creepers of all kinds had started to grow on each other, clumping together into enormous floral braids that spiraled up and down throughout the forest. A tiny head popped out of one of them. It stared at Moylan for a few seconds, with large round eyes that covered half its face. Then a long tongue shot out of its mouth and caught a huge flying insect. After that, the creature was gone. He recognized it as a marsimar, the smallest primate to be found in the Cloud Hills. They were not uncommon, but extremely secretive, which meant that actually seeing one was rare. The only evidence of its presence was a slight movement within the tangle, which just as easily could have been the wind. An arched wooden bridge crossed over the stream. By the looks of it, it had been thoroughly repaired recently, if not completely rebuilt, as the planks were still pale and unweathered. Beyond the ravine was the last wide bend in the road before the manor. As a child, Moylan had remembered the distance being significantly longer, but it had been well over a decade since he last came here. The Moylanad family had been among the first to settle in the Northern Hills, years before Moylan was born. When his father had married into the family, the collective domains of the two houses had been enough to award them several seats in the highest council, and therefore some of the best land in the freshly cleared hillside regions. Before the true potential of the bloodbirch sap had been discovered, there had been very little interest in settling to the north. The dense underground also made the area largely inaccessible. Only woodlings and other Deepwood dwellers were able to traverse the labyrinth of roots and branches, and the only fairies who lived there were the wild ones, who still hunted, gathered, and slept among the tree branches like in ancient times. However, that had all changed once the royal court wizards had discovered the powerful magical properties of bloodbirch sap. It had long been used in small quantities for both medicine and potions, but through the use of this new magic, the potency could be increased tenfold, or even hundredfold, if only the purest sap was used. That's why his aunt and uncle had given his father this piece of land as a wedding gift all those years ago. Mogran had been more than eager to take charge of its development, both because he wanted to prove his usefulness to the family, and, Moylan suspected, because he was glad for an opportunity to be away from the hustle and bustle of Silmenian high society. Clearly, the young fairy thought to himself, as he observed his father pick his teeth with a twig and then toss it into the bushes. That man had never been suited for an upper-class life in Kistrala, sipping brandy and eating tiny pastries while discussing foreign politics and the latest court drama. The road climbed another narrow ridge, snaking between a number of large, outjutting rocks on the cliffside. It was the smell that made Moylan's stomach turn before he even saw it. When the wind picked up as they reached the crest, it carried with it the scent of death and destruction. For a second, he didn't even recognize the place at all. The Moylanad estate lay on the northern edges of the Cloud Hills, or at least it used to. In Moylan's memory, the manor had been right at the edge of the upper mesa, where one could stand by the fence and gaze down into the forest below. Vertiginous serpentine paths had traced the thick roots down the slopes. There, on a wide shelf, had been a quaint little woodling hamlet. In later years it had been largely abandoned due to the constant Motstan attacks, but in the past there had been several families living there. Some had orchards, and others had made a living bird fishing, or herding cattle up and down the mossy tree trunks. Now, there was no hamlet. In fact, the entire shelf had been stripped bare. The longer he looked, the less sure Moylan was of where the village had even been. What had been a sprawling forest twice the size of the Moylanad domain was now a barren field of mud and blackened stumps. Here and there were the charred remains of structures, but in their condition he couldn't tell if they had been houses or just temporary fortifications. Along the edge of the plateau, beyond which the forest grew even denser and deeper, stood multiple rows of sharpened palisade walls. Without the cover of trees, the area looked a lot smaller than it once had. Thin trails of smoke rose up towards the sky, some from the ruins, and others from lumps of ash and bits of things that Moylan did not want to look at too closely. Somehow, most of the larger blood birches had been preserved. Unlike the other, regular-sized trees, these ones had been cut off near the top, right below the canopies. At the base, gnarled and twisted twigs and splinters lay scattered. Around each stump, someone had erected canvas screens and dug wide ditches. Surly-looking guards poked their heads and spears up from behind the dividers, and above them, construction crews were hard at work. Hoists and pulleys were set up to carry the heavier tools and materials to the top, where woodchucks and carpenters were busy flattening the surface and drilling holes for support beams. Most of them seemed to have begun recently, but a few refineries had already been completed. They were crude, utilitarian structures. Essentially, they consisted of a large circular wooden platform resembling a giant dinner plate, with a large tent structure in the middle, inside of which the sap extraction took place. An enchanted concoction was poured into the hole drilled in the center of the tree, causing it to expel its sap rapidly, like the sickly, feverish sweating of a dying man. Tall plumes of black smoke billowed out of the vents at the top of each tent, a byproduct of this process. For this reason, those chosen to collect the sap as it poured out of the boreholes were usually prisoners or captured Motstan members. Most could only work for a few days before succumbing to the noxious fumes, After extraction, the sap was taken to the refining facilities constructed along the edge of the platform, where it was processed and prepared before being stored in one of the nearby warehouses, one of which, Moylan noted to his dismay, had been built right next to the manor, below his bedroom. "It's a shame about your mother's rose garden, of course, but it's only temporary." Somehow, the placement of the warehouse seemed to be the only thing that bothered Mogran about the chaotic scene. Not only had the workers trampled all the flowers around the building, but they had also constructed a bridge from the backyard to one of the new refineries. Solemnly, Moylan recognized the stump as the tree where his mother had first taught him to fly as a child. "On the bright side," his father continued, "the extraction company is compensating us handsomely for lending them a space on our land. There will be enough money to build a garden 10 times the size, especially now that we have space for it." Mogran grinned and gestured towards the devastation. Moylan couldn't believe his eyes. "What happened here? Where is everything?" he stammered. "Oh," Mogran muttered, as if he hadn't noticed the destruction until now. "That was all from the war, I was told. Very tragic. From what I understand, most of the woodlings are selling their land since, well, there isn't much to return to." Moylan put his hands to his forehead to block the sun and peered down into the wasteland. There, beneath one of the largest stumps on the plateau, was the only evidence of the land's previous inhabitants. 2 walls and half a rooftop. That was all that was left of the old bathhouse in what had been the village square. Beside it on the ground sat a tall, slender figure, with her face buried in her hands. A small child was rooting through the rubble next to her. The bath proprietress and her son, Moylan observed. Her husband, who had once taught Moylan how to birdfish many summers ago, was nowhere to be seen. Only a few Silmenian soldiers were lingering next to an armored muskmur, eyeing the old lady intently. Briefly, she glanced up towards the hills, and something in Moylan's gut told him that she was looking straight at him. He wasn't sure if she recognized him or not. He hoped she didn't. "Supposedly, a bunch of them have decided to go look for employment down south. I bet those are the ones we passed by earlier," his father continued. The memory of the encounter that morning came back to Moylan, and with it, the rage. "Is that right?" he countered. "Then why were they behind bars? Why were they being treated like prisoners?" "Well, I'd assume some of them were." His father's tiptoeing around the subject infuriated Moylan. "What do you mean some of them were?" he retorted, louder. Instead of matching his tone, however, Mogran exhaled and placed his hand on his son's shoulder again, as he often did when he was about to explain something difficult. "Moylan, my son, you're going to see a fair amount of things here that may seem confusing, and even cruel. The truth is, war is cruel, especially when the enemy lives right on your doorstep." "But father, not all the woodlings hate us fairies. Only the Motstan does." "That is true, but the Motstan is widespread these days. In many areas, they're so deeply entrenched that they control entire villages." His father paused for a second, watching over the ravaged landscape. Moylan thought for a brief moment that he saw the old man's eyes stir slightly. "It's not like back then," he continued. "When we first moved here, the Motstan was just a small cult that mostly kept to themselves. Your mother even used to visit that little village from time to time, remember? And there were some fairies living amongst them as well. Wild ones, and 1 or 2 of us, I believe." "Us?" Moylan interjected. "Silmenians," Mogran clarified. "Fairies who actually bathe." He guffawed. Moylan did not, but he did smirk slightly. "Either way," his father continued, "that was then. I know it's been many years since you were last here. Therefore, you must understand that the attitude is very different now." He sighed. "I'm afraid the times of peaceful coexistence may be over. The Motstan aren't just recruiting fanatics anymore. They're enlisting the help of women and children, and even the elderly have been caught aiding them in their vile acts. Our men out there say that when they're out on patrol, they can't trust anyone anymore. One day, they'll chat with a sweet old couple tending to their gardens, and the next day, the same old couple will look the other way, or even block the road as 10 Motstan assassins jump out of the trees. Other times, children or young women will approach our outpost with sweets or freshly baked pies, only to lure a whole squadron into a trap." Moylan said nothing. He could make a comment on how poorly it reflected on the Silmenian army when an entire squadron fell for the same trap. However, he chose not to. When he hadn't been traveling, his father had spent most of the last year poring over reports and rumors about the war, and he was clearly very invested, more so than Moylan had even realized. Instead, he traced the thoughts backwards in his mind to return to the topic at hand. "The captives, father," he reminded him. "That's what I mean. Most likely, some of them are suspected Motstan collaborators and will need to be interrogated before they can enter Silmenia proper. Alternatively, there could be Motstan defectors among them who would be considered traitors, which is why they were placed in a secure carriage for their own safety. One thing I've learned in the last year is that whenever you see a cage or a barred carriage around here, It's either to keep the Mustang in or out. It wasn't much of an explanation, but it was all Moylan could demand. If all the stories of the Mustang's cruelty were true, then he supposed such caution was justified. At that moment, a shout came from behind them. "Lord Moylanad, wait right there!" a booming voice commanded. It was the heavyset soldier with the demonic helmet, only he was no longer wearing the helmet, Moylan noted. Underneath was a round, surprisingly smooth face, with piercing yellow eyes and well-trimmed blonde hair. The only indication of his occupation was his slightly bent nose, although such an injury was more common with street thugs rather than trained soldiers. "Your carriage is ready, my lord," the man informed them in a much more eloquent tone than he had used earlier. Despite having ran after them while still wearing most of his armor, he was barely out of breath. He did, however, have a fresh new bruise on his chin. Evidently he had been reprimanded for his previous insolence. "It'll be here in a moment." He wasn't lying. Just as he turned to point down the road, the stagecoach appeared from out of the ravine. Somehow they had managed to get it around the prison wagon, along with the Fagels, the two Miskmers, and the entire guard company, on a road that was barely wider than Moylan was tall. "Excellent," his father said approvingly. "You boys were faster than I expected. Come, Moylan," he called out behind him as he began to saunter down to the carriage. "Just make sure you remember who your superiors are in the future," he added as he passed by the soldier. It was not the kind of authoritative voice that Mogran was used to using, Moylan observed, but the massive warrior still seemed to shrink into himself slightly as he responded. "Yes, my lord." At least it had seemed like the man was earnestly deferring to his father, but as soon as Mogran had walked past, he grinned at Moylan and made a cryptic gesture. Again, Moylan picked up the pace as he trailed behind his father without looking back. Before they reached the carriage, however, there was another noise, a short burst of faint twangs and then 3 loud thumps. 2 stubby arrows with green fletching were lodged in the carriage paneling, and the third one was buried halfway in the couchman's head. As the body slumped over, everyone turned to look for where the arrows had came from. Moylan had no time to react, much less process what had just happened. From out of the jungle along the cliffside came a roar, and then a giant woodling leapt out of the bushes, swinging a huge broadaxe. Of course, to a woodling, it might have been a normal-sized axe, but the man himself was definitely the largest specimen Moylan had ever seen. His eyelids were in full bloom, with bright yellow petals framing his eyes like the rays of the sun. He crashed into the side of the carriage and flung the back door off its hinges before anyone could stop him. When he didn't find anyone inside, he quickly spun around, glancing around the scene. His gaze was first drawn to Mogran, and then to Moylan. Clearly, the woodling had expected to find him inside. He had known that Moylan was coming, and had been lying in wait. The young fairy's eyes widened, and a chill went down his spine, as it dawned on him that he was the target of this ambush. In the edges of his vision, he saw soldiers rushing in. However, most of them immediately went to form a human shield around his father, which made sense, since their salaries technically came out of his coffers. "Lord Moylanad, get back!" one of them yelled, drawing his sword. "We'll handle this!" Moylan extended his wings, preparing to flee, but to his surprise, the large soldier with the broken nose stepped in front of him. He raised his crossbow as the woodling barreled towards them. "Don't worry, little one," his unexpected protector said quietly, without looking back. "I'd never let a monster pick on a fellow fairy, even if they're a spoiled city boy." Moylan didn't know whether to feel flattered or affronted. Soon, though, both those feelings were replaced by despair. Even if the crossbow hadn't jammed, it would have still been too late. The woodling was too fast. As the hulking beast grabbed the crossbow and snapped it like a twig, the large soldier didn't seem so large anymore. The axe-wielding warrior towered over both of them. Moylan could see each individual bark chip rippling across the creature's bulging shoulder muscles. He watched in astonishment as the giant man of the woods raised his empty hand and effortlessly swatted away the heavy-set soldier, who once more tumbled down the side of the road. With no one standing between them, the woodling barbarian looked even more imposing. He was bare-chested, although it was far from bare. His coarse black mane reached down past his massive shoulders, and an array of heavy gold rings hung from the brims of his mushroom-cap ears. His striped lips were pressed tight in anger, but he did not seem unrestrained. Keeping the sweat and his wavy bangs away from his golden eyes, Moylan noticed with a sinking feeling in his stomach, was the green and red sash of a Motstand soldier. Far too late, Moylan regained his composure. He began flapping his wings as fast as he could, but it had been over a year since his last flying lesson. He had barely even made it off the ground when the woodling reached out, grabbed him by the leg and casually slung him over his shoulder. Then he retreated with his bounty into the dark forest. Hello there! Are you enjoying the story so far? If you are, then I just want to tell you real quick about how you can support the production. On my Patreon, which is patreon.com/bowshowclub, you can become a monthly supporter and get access to bonus content, such as sketches, blooper reels, or additional illustrations that didn't make it into the video for one reason or another. And if there's anything else you'd like to see on there, like Q&As and tutorials and such, then let me know in the comments. Additionally, if you'd instead like to maybe buy me a coffee or a beer, or another fake plant to hang in the background, you can make a one-time donation at my Ko-Fi, which is ko-fi.com/bowshowtips. Every donation equals more time and effort that I can put into this work, and since I want to have as much creative freedom as possible, I'm doing it this way instead of having to rely on a bunch of big corporate sponsors. Anyway, that's all. Links are in the description, like and subscribe and hit the bell and all that. And also, thank you for watching this video. Now, back to the story. Off, he said at last. It was getting dark, and Moylan was glad that they seemed to have reached their destination. His immediate fear had gradually been subdued, and replaced with the discomfort and weariness of being carried through the jungle for many hours. Even though his abductor was being very careful with him, it was still a taxing way to travel. The woodling leapt from tree to tree, extending his large claws and using them to dig into the bark. He wore the same distinct type of shoe that nearly all woodlings had, a type of studded wooden sandal that only covered the front of the foot, since woodlings almost always walked on their toes. This allowed them to balance on tree branches easily, and many were even able to run along them at impressive speeds. His captor was one of those people. He dashed through the mossy maze at a frightening pace, across giant fallen logs, up and down twisting trunks, and even along some of the thick vines that hung like organic hawsers beneath the canopies. The view was an endless tapestry of strange dangling plants, masses of swirling leaves, colorful petals, and fuzzy creepers rushing by. Occasionally Moylan had to duck to avoid some of the larger flower clusters that grew from the surrounding lianas. Each time they carried with them a different scent, most of which were completely unfamiliar to him. As the night had begun to fall, the birds and other unseen creatures around them ceased some of their more feverish singing and chattering. Annoyingly, dew was also starting to form in the air, with some droplets being shook loose from above each time the woodling landed on a branch. The long webbed ears of a fairy were very sensitive to changes in humidity, and especially so when a drop of water landed directly on top of the grooved membranes. Therefore, Moylan was thankful for being lifted down to the ground, so he could shake the water off. He then pulled his scarf up over his head to keep the evening moisture away from his ears. Finally, he realized that the woodling had just spoken to him. "Wait, do you speak Elosian?" Moylan inquired. Elosian was the common language in Silmenia, as well as most of the surrounding kingdoms. "No," he replied flatly. His pronunciation suggested to Moylan that he knew at least a couple more words than just off and no, but he didn't want to irk his captor by questioning him. He still had no idea why he had been taken, or where, nor did he have time to look around, because the massive warrior immediately started leading him away. He did not manhandle his captive. He didn't need to. Moylan was small, even for a fairy, and he wasn't exactly a trained fighter either. The woodling, who clearly was, evidently didn't feel the need to prove his advantage. Instead, he simply pressed his large palms against the center of Moylan's back, preventing him from flapping his wings, and pushed him ahead at a moderate pace. They had stopped on top of a massive log, so wide that Moylan wouldn't even have recognized it as a tree if he hadn't seen it from above a moment ago. At ground level, it just looked like a very wide mound. Moylan was being led through the damp moss, between thickets of dense bushes and strange grasses, past giant mushrooms and branches that were as tall as regular trees. He could see more moss-covered outcroppings beyond the giant trunk below, but he couldn't make out if it was the ground or more remnants of giant fallen trees. Once or twice he thought he could see something skitter away into the darkness as they approached. Above them was the black mass of leaves that formed the ceiling of the Deepwood. Only slivers of purple dusk poked through, but it was enough to illuminate their path. At least, enough for Moylan not to stumble too often. Thankfully, the woodling was aware of their significant height difference, and slowed down every time the fairy needed to step over one of the larger patches of moss along their path. The evening was calm. The wind had died down, and much of the fauna had gone to sleep. If he wasn't being held by the wings by a Motstan soldier, Moylan would have considered it very pleasant. Of course, there was also the fact that he had been taken far into the uncharted territory of the Deepwood, where no rescuer would be able to find him. Even if they did, they were most likely surrounded by Motstan scouts hiding in every tree. The wind must have changed at that moment, because just then, Moylan became aware of something up ahead. On top of the smells of earth and wood, there were now also the faint scents of smoke, fat, and herbs. More specifically, it smelled like cooking. He looked up and instinctively perched his ears under his shawl. Then his stomach uttered a whiny growl. Moylan hadn't noticed how hungry he was until now. In fact, he couldn't remember if he had eaten at all that day. In response to the noise, the warrior chuckled quietly to himself and muttered something in his own language. "What?" Moylan asked, but the woodling didn't say anything else. Gradually, the town came into view. At first, all he could see was the glow of lights from within the foliage. Then he noticed the outline of the tall stump itself, as well as the muffled murmur of distant conversations and animal sounds. Soon, the vertical village was towering over them like a bright beacon in the night. Nestled among the roots lay several dozen houses. Some were simple huts and tent structures, while others were multi-story residences, and shops with polished wooden trims and adornments. Above, stairs and pathways had been carved out of the trunk. Windows of various shapes encircled the tall stump, and some homes had extensions with ornate facades that clung onto the outside of the tree. Higher up, the windows were fewer, but also bigger. The very top of the stump was shrouded in leaves, but out of that darkness came a few scattered and scarcely audible notes of some musical instrument. As they got closer, Moylan saw people moving around in the streets. The town didn't just extend upwards, he noticed, but also further down along the twisting routes. Far below, he could see the dancing reflections of lights above, indicating that the pitch-black surface was water. He even spotted a few small boats and barges further out that seemed to be heading home to port for the night. There were many people who were packing up carts and market booths, or shuttering their shop windows and bringing displays back inside. Others, however, were just setting up, carrying tables and chairs out onto decks and balconies, chatting and laughing and greeting each other in the streets. For some reason, Moylan hadn't expected a remote woodling town to have a very active nightlife. He also spotted the guards. If he had not been paying attention, he would have never seen the black silhouettes watching them intently from among the trees and rocks. Whether or not they were part of the Motstan was impossible to tell, but they were evidently willing to let one of them enter their town. Otherwise, Moylan and his captor would have already been perforated by arrows from all sides. The woodling had not said anything else, but Moylan could tell that he wanted to get to their destination as fast as possible, because he kept walking faster and faster. By the third time Moylan tripped in the moss, the tall man sighed and looked down at him. He made a gesture towards his shoulder. Moylan's feet were aching, and he saw no reason to decline, so he simply nodded and lifted his arms up. The warrior picked him up and casually sat him on his back. Then he stood up on his toes and picked up his stride. Moylan should have felt embarrassed, he knew that, but he also should have felt terrified about being kidnapped in the first place, and yet he was too tired to feel either. Instead, he yawned and fixed his gaze on the warm, inviting lights ahead. At last, they made it to the gates. Of course, the town wasn't actually fortified. Moylan knew enough about woodland culture to know that the main defenses and valuables were most likely kept in the central structure and in tunnels underneath it. As such, the entrance to the main street was simply a wide, ornate bridge. At each end was a tall wooden archway, to which various decorative streamers and buntings were affixed with strings. Beyond the bridge, the street curved gently along the roots towards the big tree. It wasn't crowded, but there was a decent number of people milling about. A vendor was frying something on a stick, and it smelled delicious. To Moylan's dismay, however, his captor made a hard left instead of continuing along the main street. He took him to a set of curving stairs that were inset into the side of one of the routes. At the top was a walkway that led up to a large circular platform with an opening in the middle. Through the opening ran several cables that were attached to something way up in the darkness. Below the platform, Moylan saw that holes had been drilled for the thick ropes. There was a hollowed-out space inside the giant root. Inside, he could glimpse what appeared to be a complex pulley system, comprising several gears, wheels, and blocks. He glanced down over the edge of the platform to look for the opposite ends of the cables. On one side was the main street. From this angle, Moylan could see what the vendor was frying. It looked to be doughy bread that had been twisted in a twin spiral shape around the stick, topped with what smelled like honey, and possibly some type of nuts. With a sigh, Moylan leaned away from the alluring scent, and turned to look down the other side. There he saw a long, narrow yard full of large footprints. At one end there was a small, square hut built on poles. Below it stood a young man, leaning against one of the poles, and tipping his hat to a pair of women walking by in delicate evening gowns. They giggled in response. He smirked and looked like he was about to say something, but just then the warrior called out to him. He grinned and said something back to the Motstan soldier, and then he climbed the ladder and went into the hut. A moment later, the man emerged from a doorway onto a narrow balcony, holding a basket full of dried fruit. With a sharp voice, he shouted something towards the other end of the yard, while rattling the basket. This behavior completely mystified Moylan for a second, but then he heard a familiar grunting noise. From another large opening further away in the tree root, 2 miskmers emerged, and then 2 more. While this was happening, there was a loud creaking noise coming from below the platform. Suddenly, a peculiar-looking cage rose from the hole in the center. In a way, it reminded Moylan of a gazebo, except it was made entirely from wrought iron, had a gate at the front, and was attached to the rope above and below. As the warrior lifted him down to the floor and led him into the cage, he finally figured out what was going on. He turned around and looked down at the yard through the bars. Below, the man with the basket was tossing some of the fruit on the ground below the hut. Then he put the basket down and clapped his hands in the air twice. The mistmers began lumbering towards the pile of fruit, and the elevator jolted. Somewhere in the interior of the route, the pulley system was connected to harnesses worn by the mistmers, and as they began to walk, the iron cage started ascending. The warrior, towering over Moylan in the cramped cage, carefully shut and latched the gate. Then he made a gesture to the man at the deck of the hut, who returned it with another grin. He hollered at the mistmers and threw an extra handful of fruit down to encourage them to pick up the pace. Soon, Moylan and the woodling were high up in the air. The sight of the mistmers and the elevator operator quickly disappeared behind leafy branches. Briefly, the whole vale below was on display. The town spread out in front of them in a winding network of lights, like the veins on a flower petal. Beyond it was a large black mass, stretching from east to west, which Moylan assumed to be a wide river. In all other directions there was nothing but dense woods. Pale trunks shone bluish in the evening light, against a backdrop of dark foliage. There were no bird calls, nor had the night insects begun their symphony, and yet the whole forest resonated with the inaudible hum of life. In the distance, Moylan spotted more lights. It looked like there were a few tiny farmsteads and fisheries further away along the river. Before he could take it all in, however, the view disappeared as the shaky elevator passed into a fog of leaves. For another minute or so, all he could see were tiny wedges of evening sky here and there as the iron cage ascended through the canopy. The only sounds were the creaking of the carriage, rustling leaves, and the occasional branch snapping against the interlaced iron bars. Moylan didn't enjoy being inside the cage. It wasn't that he was afraid of heights, or particularly claustrophobic, but he was worried that if it fell, he would be trapped inside and unable to fly away. He had no idea how reliable woodling technology was. It was certainly more rustic in its design than similar contraptions one might see in modern cities like Kistrala or Sundramil. Still, the warrior seemed entirely relaxed, and so Moylan supposed he had no reason to be on edge either. Again, apart from the fact that he was being held captive in a Motstan-allied town in the middle of the Deepwood. At last, they emerged above the leaves. From below, Moylan had not quite grasped how far it was to the top. What had looked like a tall stump from below was more accurately described as a still living tree that had merely been snapped in two. He surmised that the top half was probably the wide log they had walked across on the way there. All around them, the giant canopies swayed gently in the waning wind, their edges glowing red from the last horizontal rays of the sun. This created a bright circle above, framing the night sky like an undulating scarlet halo. As the elevator finally came to a rocking halt by another platform, Moylan gasped at the sight. The top of the tree had been carved into a tiered garden that had been skillfully chiseled into the shapes of various creatures. There were woodlings, fairies, and other beings, many of which Moylan did not recognize. Surrounding the garden, the bark had been similarly shaped into a curving outer wall, which not only shielded the plants from strong winds, but also served as a canvas for colorful murals. Fruit vines dangled from some of the higher platforms, and narrow orchards provided shade along the paths. There was even a pond, where a few water birds bobbed sleepily. Everything was bathed in crimson and deep purple by the late evening light. What had truly taken Moylan's breath away, however, was the tall castle in the center. It was a large pagoda, brightly lit, with bract-like annexes, turrets, and balconies, protruding like scales on a giant conifer cone. From each one hung banners and satin ribbons, billowing flower pots on ropes, clattering wind chimes, and other knickknacks. Thin smoke trails rose here and there from vents concealed behind decorations. Moylan could see people moving around inside, and when he angled his ears upwards, he could hear music. It was the same instrument that he had heard before, a shrill metallic whistling, almost buzzing at times, yet nevertheless it provided a very lively tune. For some reason, it struck him as odd that someone would be playing such energetic music this late in the evening. The source of the sound was high up, so Moylan craned his neck. There, atop one of the highest balconies, sat a tall woman playing a mysterious instrument. It was a circular arrangement of reed pipes, seemingly carved directly out of tree roots, and bound together with what looked like resin and delicate metal wires. The woman moved her hands across the instrument lightly and deftly, using both her fingertips, palms, and the back of her hands to cover the holes. She had long, slender hands, even for a woodling woman. Her closed eye petals, vibrantly violet against her dark hair, danced along with the movement. Several pixies swirled around her head with pins and ribbons, adjusting braids and combing back errant locks. They, too, seemed to move with the rhythm of the music. At least, until the lady opened her eyes, and her piercing amber gaze met Moylan's. As the jovial melody trailed off, all the pixies turned their heads towards the cause of the interruption. Suddenly the woman stood up, scattering the pixies in the air. "Edil!" she exclaimed. Moylan didn't know what the word meant. A longer string of woodling words followed, as the tall lady lifted her hands to her forehead in apparent exasperation. Then she gestured for them to stay where they were. Completely unhindered by her flowing, half-untied robe and unfastened strands of long black hair, she skipped lightly down the stair-like ridging of the rooftops. A few seconds later, she was on the ground, hurrying towards them as fast as she could in her tall heels. The shoes seemed significantly less useful for running on flat terrain than for jumping between wooden beams, Moylan observed. "Please forgive him," pleaded the regal-looking lady as she came tiptoeing down to the elevator platform where Moylan and his captor stood. Strangely, he noted, her Elocian did not ring with the typical woodling accent, but rather she spoke Sundramilian. Clearly his surprise showed on his face. "Oh, I've lived in Silmenia for a number of years," Lord Moylanad. That answered one question and raised another. "Are you not Moylan Moylanad, son of Baron Mogran Moylanad?" she wondered when she saw that he was still confused. "Yes," he admitted. "That's me." "It's an honor to meet you, my lord." She bowed deeply. "I apologize that it's under such embarrassing circumstances." The warrior snorted disapprovingly at her words. Or his words? Moylan wasn't sure. There was a faint shadow of stubble across her freckled face, and although he didn't intentionally look at her bare chest as she hastily tied her robe, an accidental glance revealed it to be completely flat. Nevertheless, her dress and demeanor were entirely female. Her bashful smile at the awkwardness of their encounter was also that of a woman. Then her smile faded and was replaced by annoyance as she looked down to the man below him. "Edil," she hissed again. The words that followed were in the woodling tongue. In response, the barbarian raised his big arms, grabbed Moylan by the waist, and set him down on the ground. "He hasn't hurt you, has he?" the tall lady asked while adjusting Moylan's hat and plucking a twig from his hair. He was utterly dumbfounded by the whole interaction. "No," he managed. "Should he have?" It was the woman's turn to look confused. Then she started to laugh. After catching her breath for a second, she translated the interaction to the Motstan man, who began chuckling as well. Moylan had no idea how to react. "Sorry," the lady said after calming down. "No, he absolutely shouldn't have. He shouldn't have touched you at all. But apparently he doesn't listen to me," she accused with a venomous sideways glance towards the warrior. Clearly, though, he didn't understand her Elocian, and so he simply returned a blank stare. The lady sighed and rolled her eyes. "Again, please forgive him," she continued, looking back to Moylan. "I'll explain. Come with me." She gestured at him to follow and dismissed his abductor, which she evidently had the authority to do. She sat down on a bench that resembled some sort of large feline. They had walked along the edge of the rooftop garden to a small nook surrounded by berry bushes. There was a sundial on display in the center, and behind it the bark wall dipped to provide a view of the dark mass of forest beyond. "My name is Sulsanja, by the way," she said after a second of silence. "Your captor's name is Edil, as you probably would have guessed." Then she pulled out a small pouch from within her robe, produced an ornate pipe, and began packing it with dried leaves from an even smaller pouch. They smelled sweet. "Do you want some?" she offered. "It's Flutterbloom, finest blend in all of Valsimor." Moylan debated briefly in his head whether or not it would be impolite to decline. After a moment he settled on honesty and shook his head demurely. "No, but thank you." He had tried Flutterbloom once in Sundramil, but he hadn't liked it very much. It just made him tired and confused, which he already was. "More for me, then." She snapped her fingers, and all of a sudden a pixie came flying, holding a small candle. The minuscule maid lit the pipe, and then waited for her master to inhale deeply. After a moment she exhaled, creating a large cloud of acrid orange smoke. Moylan wrinkled his nose, but the smell was quickly wafted away by the evening breeze. A few seconds passed. "Where was I?" Sulsanja asked suddenly. Moylan didn't answer. He was still befuddled by her informality in contrast to her apparent status. He didn't know if it was a language barrier or a cultural difference. "Oh right, you were kidnapped," she reminded herself. "That's why you're here. I'm sorry, I only just woke up," she admitted with a grin. "To be honest, I don't know much more than you do. They were talking about abducting you last night, but I told them it was a bad idea. Besides, we were going to discuss it tonight before making any decisions. I hope they weren't the ones who put Edil up to this." "Who?" Moylan asked as soon as he could get a word in. "Some of the other mothers," she explained without explaining anything. "Other mothers?" "Yes, the night mothers from some of the other villages up north." When Moylan's expression remained unchanged, she sighed. Then she looked at him with a mix of enmity and pity. "They don't teach you much, do they?" She stood up. "Come, we'll sort the rest out in the morning. We need to find a place for you to sleep before the midnight council starts." So Sanja began trotting off on her heels, which, Moylan noted with a pang of sudden envy, were shaped like bowing fagels. They were lacquered jade, and their gilded wings were spread out and covered in pearls. She turned around and noticed that he hadn't moved. "What's wrong? Would you rather stay outside?" He didn't want to admit that he had simply been briefly stunned by jealousy. Then another thought occurred to him in response to her question. "What prevents me from leaving?" he asked, flexing his wings and nodding towards the dense forest below. "Oh," she said, "because there will be hostage negotiations, no matter what we decide tonight. I'm sure your father knows that you're missing at this point, right? We'll have to reach some kind of settlement before we can let you go." That's not what I meant. Why can't I just jump off and fly away from here right now?" he inquired with a raised eyebrow, extending his wings fully. "Of course they're pink," she observed with a wry smile. "How pretty." Moylin flushed redder than the berries on the bush behind them. He stammered. Her comment had taken him completely aback. "Anyway, it's because the Motstan won't let you," she added casually. As if on command, a short woodling holding a blowgun emerged from the bush. He was dressed in a suit made of cloth leaves, with real ones stuck onto it as well. His face was entirely covered by a dark green scarf, aside from a narrow gap in the middle, through which light blue eye petals peered out. Moylin jumped. "Your Highness," he addressed her in Elocian. Clearly it was a way of letting Moylin know that he had been listening to the conversation. Without a word, he saluted the second guard who had also appeared out of nowhere to take the first one's place. A second later, both of them were gone. Moylin did not press the matter further. Following behind Sulsanja, his mind started to wander. He was tired. Surely a rescue operation would most likely not be mounted until the morning, if any of his father's men had managed to follow them at all. If someone had, they would never sneak into a woodling hive alone in the middle of the night. For now, Moylin was just thankful that these people seemed to understand that he was worth more alive than dead. He just wanted to sleep. As they approached the castle, he noticed that Edil had been waiting for them by the steps leading to the main gate. The barbarian stepped in front of Sulsanja and bowed deeply, his long dark locks almost touching the ground. Then he mumbled something to her and gestured towards Moylin before heading off in the direction of the elevator. Sulsanja turned around and stared at him. "Oh, what a fool I am! And to think I was just about to send you off to bed," she exclaimed. "Gunisi! Pimsos!" Two pixies came buzzing from within the castle. Sulsanja said something in a commanding voice while pointing at Moylin. Immediately, in response to her words, they took off upwards and in through a window above. Moylin could hear them barking orders to others inside. Suddenly there was a slam of metal against metal, and what sounded like a knife being sharpened. His blood ran cold. What in Alros's name had Edil told Sulsanja? A moment ago it had seemed like they weren't interested in harming him, but the warrior's words had clearly changed everyone's attitude. Hesitantly, he asked, "What did he say about me?" Sulsanja gave him another pitying look. "Forgive me once more. I should have known," she said wearily. "No need to worry though. It's being taken care of. Gunisi and Pimsos are getting you something from upstairs. It shouldn't be more than a few minutes." Once again, Moylin could only look perplexed in response. "Oh, right," she exclaimed. "He said you're hungry."